This is the Data Slice, hosted by the Data Science Alliance. It's where we sit down to talk all things data science, AI, and tech, any way you slice it. I'm Callan Hovman, and joining us today is Dr. David Danks. He has lots of expertise in several different areas, so we're really excited to have you. I know that you are a data science and philosophy and policy professor. You have interest in all those different realms. You've examined the ethical, psychological, and policy issues around AI and robotics in lots of different ways. I'm going to let you kind of explain your background all to the full extent in a moment. But first off, how are you? Welcome to our podcast. We're excited to have you.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here. I think DSA does wonderful work. It's great to get to talk to you some more.
Yeah, you're definitely a friend of DSA. We appreciate it. Dr. Danks was a speaker at one of our events just last week, so thanks for letting us drag you back in for the podcast this week. I was thinking for the people who might not know you, to just kind of start things off, could you tell us a little more about your background? I know I just glossed over at surface level, so could you maybe talk a little more about kind of where it all began for you and what your path kind of was that led you to kind of what you're up to today?
Sure. So it's an entirely academic background, but it's a very eclectic academic background. So I started life as a math major, transitioned into becoming a philosophy major, then went to philosophy graduate school, never having read anybody before about 1900, which is a little bit strange for philosophy. Usually people actually understand the history of it, and I didn't. But it was a field where I could ask the questions that were interesting to me. So did a PhD in philosophy, and then after a couple of years ended up at Carnegie Mellon for 18 years doing cognitive science, philosophy of science, and what we would now call AI. This was back many years ago, a couple decades ago, when AI was kind of not a term that most people were comfortable using. It was the thing that maybe you would use that term with your parents, but nobody in academia would ever have said they did AI. They did, maybe it was machine learning, but more likely it was computer vision or semi-parametric learning or any of the many subfields that we have. And was working on that, and then came to the realization that a lot of the methods that were being developed were being used in ways that perhaps the people who developed them didn't intend or didn't have in mind when they set out to create a particular method. And this was in the early 2010s, and it got me very interested in questions of ethics and policy. What is, as somebody who builds AI systems, what are my ethical responsibilities? What are my professional responsibilities in terms of thinking ahead to all the different uses that my systems could have? And I kind of thought, well, I'll figure this out for myself, get my own personal ethics in order, because surely people have solved this problem, right? How hard could it be? Yeah, that was a bit of a wake-up call when I realized just how deeply hard these problems are.
Yeah.
And that set me off on a path doing ethics and policy in a way that I never thought that I was going to do. I always thought that I would be a sort of technical philosopher, which is actually a thing, and instead have ended up bringing to bear my technical background to ask lots of really hard questions about what our personal and professional ethical responsibilities are, what practices in the creation of AI would be better. And then that all brought me here to San Diego about 3.5 years ago to join the Halegiolu Data Science Institute. As you said, cross-listed between data science, philosophy, and policy.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a combo that people would necessarily expect. Do you think you're kind of that combination of interests and background has really helped you just find success, especially as a professor, has really helped you kind of teach students?
It certainly helps on the teaching side because students come to these questions, come to these problems from a really wide variety of backgrounds. So we have students who perhaps are really interested in the societal implications. They're sociology majors. Right. But then there's the student who comes to it because they're working on optimizing a chip design, and then they discover that the chip is going to be put into medical devices. And so they become really worried about what are the failure modes and how do they figure out the failure modes of their chip design, right? So it's this just incredibly diverse set of backgrounds that the students come with. And I somehow have to teach all of them. And so the fact that I myself have this diverse background, that a student can walk in and say, I don't know anything about AI, I'm a humanities student, and I can say, it's okay.
Mm.
I'm a humanist also, right? Somebody who's trained in the humanities, or somebody comes from statistics, and I can say, yeah, it's okay. I'll teach you the ethics. I'll help you come to understand how to think about these problems. That's invaluable. It does sometimes get a little lonely, I'll say, exactly because, as you said, I mean, I'm not a unicorn, but it's an unusual combination. I'm probably think the only person with my exact title maybe in the world. But it means that I find I spend a lot of time in other people's communities. I'm often the person who gets brought in because philosophers and historians will be talking about the nature of computing and how it's changed society, and they go, "Well, we need somebody who's one of us but also understands the technology," and so I get that call. But I'm not really part of that community, and I will say that that's one of the challenges with any interdisciplinary effort is that you often end up kind of not quite at home in anybody's domain.
I could see that. Yeah, makes sense. Do you feel like with students that you've kind of seen their interests change and grow, as the technology develops? Like you said, you've been in the industry for a long time. So as it's changing, do you feel like the students and their questions and maybe even your approach have kind of had to almost change?
Absolutely. If we go back to 2015, I know it's a long time ago, but a decade ago, AI was still a curiosity. You're starting to see the emergence of things like Facebook AI research, Google X, Microsoft research, really moving into the AI space. But it was still a research idea. It wasn't something that people saw the practical implications or practical applications of it. And that held for the students too. The students were still coming to questions of things like ethical and societal implications, and they're sort of like, yeah, but that's 20 years away. And then you start to have things like AlphaGo, where suddenly people say, wait a second, Go is this game that we're not supposed to be able to solve with AI, for decades, and it's better than humans. And obviously things have only accelerated since then. At the time I was in Pittsburgh, and so we suddenly saw self-driving cars being tested on our roads in our neighborhoods. And so it became very real for the students all of a sudden. But it still, at that moment, was largely this kind of abstract inquiry. It wasn't viewed yet as a thing that the people who were building the systems needed to think about. It was for everybody else. The people who weren't building the systems, how should they wrestle with the changing world around them? And so what's been striking over this 10-year period is how much that has flipped. Increasingly now, I find that almost all of my students are coming from the technical disciplines. They're the data scientists, the computer engineers, who are really craving some kind of framework and lessons on how to think about what they're doing and how they can do it better, how they can not make all the mistakes that my generation made when we were building technology back in the 2000s, such as social media. And in contrast, I think the students from the humanities and social sciences background now are increasingly feeling as though they're on the outside, that there's this world of technology that they can't contribute to, they can't influence. And so they're almost becoming disengaged from a lot of the ethical questions because they don't see that they can really influence it. So it's been really, in some ways, challenging, in other ways, very exciting to see how the set of students has changed. And now, of course, the challenge is how do we bring it full circle and get everybody working towards these common goals of more responsible and trustworthy AI, as opposed to, at any moment in time, some group feeling like they're either disempowered or it's not their responsibility.
What are your thoughts on that? And is there advice that you give them when it comes to kind of that idea that it's kind of on everybody now? We all really need to be thinking about the ethics of AI and data.
Right. Well, on the technical side, I try to get students to understand that most of their training, most of their education focuses on how do you go from data to model. But of course, anyone who's ever actually done AI or actually built a data science system knows that there's a wealth of questions that you have to answer beyond just how you go from data to model. And those are all places that values and ethics can creep into your system. And I say creep in as though that's a bad thing. It's inevitable, right? You have to make these choices. And so for the technical students, I tend to focus on the idea that they should really emphasize being intentional about the choices they make along the way. For the less technical students, the challenge right now, I think for many of them, is exactly the barriers to entry. They can't credibly get into the room to make a difference unless either they have an expertise in policy and they go down the sort of regulatory route, or if they actually understand enough about the technology to talk with the people who are building it. And I think it's important to see that it's not that they have to be able to code themselves, but they have to understand how coders think, which is a little unusual sometimes. And so that's a lot of the other kind of teaching I do, is helping people recognize how they can contribute to these kinds of AI creation efforts without themselves writing code. And I think there's a lot that people who are trained in sociology, anthropology, economics, communication, philosophy, and rattle off the disciplines, there's a lot that they can bring to the table, but they have to know how to meet the engineers where the engineers are, rather than, unfortunately, expecting the engineers to be able to come to them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, so say there's a student who, like you said, all sorts of disciplines, say there's a student who is a communications major. I personally was journalism. I don't think I really took a data science class or anything like that. Do you think that should maybe become a norm? Everyone, regardless of their true major and career path, should we really all be at least kind of studying and understanding in a way?
No,
Okay.
actually.
Makes me feel better.
Yeah. So yes and no, right? It's more complicated than this. So I don't think that there's much point in having people take a traditional intro to data science course.
Okay.
I think most people, that's not actually helpful, because what do you learn in intro to data science? You learn basic coding, basic statistics, and that's not actually what people need. What they need is to understand how to think about a problem or a question from the perspective of data science. What are the ingredients, as it were, that go into the creation of a data science product or application? Understanding what you can and can't learn from data, what you can and can't extract from data, what are the limitations on models. This is not about how you actually build the thing. It's about understanding what you can and can't do with it. By an analogy, I came here in a car that I could not possibly fix, but I know how to use it. And I know if I went into a mechanic to be able to say, here's the noises it's making that don't make any sense, and here's the weird behavior that it's exhibiting. Can you help me troubleshoot it? And I think that that's the kind of intro to data science that people need, but that's not what we're traditionally offering in most universities. I say most because that's one of the things I'm trying to fix, right? Is at UC San Diego, I'm trying to create and offer classes that exactly are intended for the people who are not going to build these systems, but have to understand how to think about these systems, how to help improve these systems, even when they never are going to write a line of code.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. That's a good analogy too, especially the car situation. That's good for someone like me who was liberal arts. Makes it make sense. Right. Well, so a big topic within all of this, whether it's for students or working professionals, and just all of us really these days, is policies, regulation, and I know you are on the National AI Advisory Committee. I know there's a acronym or pronunciation that you can clarify for me. Right. But could you tell us a little more about that and what your experience with that is?
Sure. The National AI Advisory Committee, we call it NIAC.
That's what it is. Thank you.
Yes, and obviously I'm here in my personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of NIAC in any way. But it is a congressionally mandated advisory committee that was launched about 3 years ago, whose our job, really is to provide advice to the executive branch and the White House here of the U.S. government on kind of all things having to do with AI. So that ranges from what kinds of governance mechanisms should the U.S. government put into place? How should the U.S. government procure AI systems? How should they obtain ones they're going to use? What is the role of the U.S. government when it comes to AI literacy and workforce development? All the way to advice about the U.S. On the international stage, because of course AI does not respect national borders in the way that we might want. And so AI governance is a global problem. It's a global challenge, and we need to coordinate with like-minded countries and recognize that not everybody is like-minded. And so there are going to be, and there are, different ways of approaching AI governance globally, and we really need to think about how to work collectively towards more responsible, more trustworthy AI. So that's really the goal of the NIAC. Of course, things get a lot more complicated when you have 25 to 27 smart, opinionated folks on it, because we don't agree all the time. In fact, we often disagree. And so that's been really interesting to sort of work through the different perspectives and try to come to consensus recommendations for the White House about how we can advance U.S. interests when it comes to AI.
How did you get involved, and how are the other people involved? How do you kind of become a part of this committee?
So you have to be nominated, and I was lucky enough that somebody nominated me because, in part, I had previously been very involved in something called the National Security Commission on AI, which was about a 3-year effort to help understand the ways in which AI was impacting national security issues here in the United States in the latter part of the 2010s. And I was very involved on the sort of what was called the ethics line of effort of the NSCAI. And so because of that, was nominated to be a part and was lucky enough to be chosen as one of the inaugural members. So in that sense, it's a closed group. The Secretary of Commerce is ultimately the one who selects the people who will serve on NIAC, and we serve 3-year terms that are potentially renewable. But what I think is important to see is that that's the members. There's a tremendous number of opportunities for the public to become engaged in the work we're doing for NIAC. We have regular public meetings. We have public briefings where we hear from members of the public. We hear from members of industry or academic researchers about what are the coming issues, the things that are on the horizon that we need to be thinking about right now in terms of AI. And many opportunities, regular opportunities for the public to provide us with comments. And I know sometimes people think that comments go into the ether and disappear and nobody looks at it. I will say the majority, if not all of the members of NIAC, we read every single comment that comes in. We don't get that many, but every comment that comes in, when it's a 3-page, sometimes commentary from, for example, a nonprofit advocacy group, we read it because it's important that somebody took the time to reach out. It shows the level of passion and insight that they presumably have. And we need to learn from that, because I think in that sense, being on the NIAC has been a very humbling experience for me. I've quickly been reminded of how little I know, because I look at the geniuses around me on the committee, and I'm constantly struck that these are folks who know so much more than I do in particular areas. I mean, I know more than they do in some other areas, but it's really an opportunity to learn and grow.
We obviously had an administration change. We had an election year recently. What was that like to be on the committee when there was an election and we had a new president come in? Do you feel like the committee had to maybe adjust, or were there steps you took with the inauguration, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we had to adjust for the simple reason that we as a committee make recommendations. We don't give orders. And you want your recommendations to fall on fertile soil. And if you frame recommendations in one way rather than another, they may not be received in quite the same way. Or recommendations that might be, very appealing to one administration are going to be less appealing to another one. And so we certainly did have to do some adaptation. We would have had to do it either way. Right? If there had been a Harris administration, it would not have been a simple continuation of the Biden administration. Right. There would have been changes that would have occurred. And so for that reason, or partially for that reason, we as a committee, we had decided that we wanted to give 10 recommendations to the new administration. And we actually waited until after the election. There were a lot of reports that were coming out from various organizations prior to the election about what the new administration should do. But we wanted to make sure that the recommendations we were giving would be received appropriately by the new administration. That meant thinking about what are the priorities of the new administration, what are the things that they care the most about, which meant waiting to figure out who that administration is going to be. So I'm very happy to report that a few weeks ago at our most recent public meeting, we were able to have a unanimous vote in favor of sending those 10 recommendations to the White House. And I believe they either have been transmitted or are in the midst of being transmitted now.
Are you able to tell us what maybe some of the recommendations are? Kind of give an example of what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So one example of the recommendations, one that I worked very heavily on, is about people's personal digital safety. So I think a lot of us have now come to understand that AI threatens our personal digital safety, whether it's the horrific series of ransom calls that are done using falsified audio that make it sound like it's somebody's kid calling with a ransom, or denudifying apps that can take pictures of high schoolers and render them as if they don't have any clothing on. I mean, you hear these stories almost every day, and they're really appalling. And then you've got all the economic threats and the threats against ransomware against hospitals, and these enormous range of threats to our personal digital safety are being tackled by different parts of the federal government. And they're being tackled by different parts in overlapping and not always pulling in the same direction ways. And so this is exactly the sort of case where it's critical that we have the federal government taking the lead on this. This is not something that state governments necessarily are well equipped to help people protect their personal digital safety, but it's also important that we have a kind of whole of government approach at the federal level. So one of the recommendations was that the White House needs to form a task force that is able to coordinate across the dozens of agencies, literally dozens of agencies, that are worried about problems of personal digital safety in the federal government, so that we're not having groups work at cross purposes. And I think this is kind of emblematic of the kinds of recommendations that we can do in NIAC, because the government, the day-to-day, it's so easy for parts of the government to get caught up in their day-to-day job. It's true of all of us, right?
Right.
And so having an external body who can look and say, it's wonderful that there's all of this work happening, but think how much more impactful it could be with just a very thin layer of coordination. We just need groups to know what each other are doing. And that's going to happen at the level of the White House. That can't happen at the level of any particular agency. So that's an example. Others advocate for increased resources and support for small businesses who are trying to ensure that what the AI systems that they're developing actually are trustworthy and support all Americans, even those who have been left behind over the last 10 to 20 years. And that's going to, again, require an investment from the federal government and a renewed focus on developing the tools and frameworks that are needed for small businesses.
What has it been like for you as someone who, is very knowledgeable in this whole area to kind of see those conversations happening? Is it maybe, does it feel positive, optimistic to be a part of this committee and hear people, working together to create policies that help people in the end?
Yes, but my hesitation reveals a lot, right?
I'm sure it's complicated.
It is. It's incredibly inspiring to see the number of people who are willing to devote hours and hours of time out of their incredibly busy lives to try to make a difference. It's exciting to see the hunger for knowledge throughout the US government, the people who are realizing that their job at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is being reshaped by AI, and they need to understand AI, and they want to engage and continue to serve the mission of their agency, but they realize that mission is now made more complicated by AI. So that's all incredibly inspiring. And then you run into the challenges of large organizations, of which the federal government's a very large one, the challenges of the diversity of values and viewpoints that you find across the United States and that are represented across the government. The challenges of, this person wants to do something, but they don't have the authority to. This person has the resources, but not the authority. This person has the authority, but neither the resources nor the desire. And so solving these coordination problems becomes a huge challenge, right? So it is this immense puzzle that we're continually just having to do a little bit better each day. I mean, that's sort of the mantra is each time we meet as NIAC, let's try to improve things just a little bit more for the federal government. Let's try and make recommendations that'll make things work a little bit better. There is no silver bullet here. There is no magic potion that if we just took it, suddenly everything would work. And so a lot of it is just maintaining the sort of focus on, okay, let's just keep plugging away at this problem, because it can be so big as to sometimes feel a little overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Something else that probably adds to the overwhelming feeling is how this, like you said earlier, this is a global, international topic. It's not just for us in the US at all. So what is it like to be on the committee and kind of be seeing other countries, obviously the other countries have their own policies going on. Does that influence your committee's conversations at all? I assume there's kind of that global perspective too.
It does. I would use the word informs our discussions rather than influence necessarily. So certainly, for example, in the United States, the ways in which the government has governed AI, has regulated AI, has largely been in a very sector-specific way. So I earlier mentioned the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They came out several years ago and sort of publicly said, hey, companies, if you discriminate in hiring, we're going to come and investigate you, even if you used AI. Like saying we used AI is not a get out of jail free card. We're still going to investigate you. And companies, I think, said, wait a second, but what if it was the AI? What if that was the reason why there was the discrimination? And the EEOC basically said, yeah, take that up with the company that sold you the AI. That's not our fault. You discriminated against people, right? So in that way, in the US, we actually have had a lot of, I don't want to use the term actually regulation, but governance of AI systems in this very sector-specific way, with sector-specific agencies who've recognized that the ways in which things function in their sector have changed because of AI. And so that's the US landscape, by and large. European Union is completely different. So in the EU, they have the AI Act, which was passed last year, that essentially is a cross-sector, across all sectors, governance mechanism for AI writ large. So any AI in any sector, especially those that are high risk or high consequence, falls under the scope of the AI Act. It's a sort of omnibus in that way. And it's a completely different model than what we've done here in the US. And it's not to say one is better and one's worse, it's to say they have different strengths and weaknesses. So our discussion about what kinds of recommendations to make in the US context are informed by what's working in the EU and what's not. What are the challenges that they're running into? For example, in practice, they have to give some sector-specific guidance because self-driving cars and recommender systems on Facebook it's hard to have a single legislation that actually intelligently covers all of them. So they have to do sector-specific work. But nonetheless, there's something to be said for having a shared set of principles that govern all of them that we haven't had here in the United States. So that raises opportunities for us on the NIAC to, are there recommendations we could make to try to unify the ways in which we're governing AI in the United States? In the other direction, of course, we're trying to shape the way that things happen in other places. Because it is one of the looming challenges, not looming, it's already here, challenges for AI governance internationally is this mismatch between the governance systems that we're seeing. We're seeing the emergence of a number of different ways of trying to govern and manage AI, not just the US and the EU, but the UK, Australia, India, China, Singapore, all have their own ways of tackling this, and some are more similar than others, but we're running the risk of creating sort of a mismatch, at which point the worry is that the world sort of falls into a race to the bottom. What's the country that is willing to have the loosest governance, the least amount of regulation, and then do companies move all of their AI development to that place? Because exactly as I said earlier, AI doesn't respect national borders. It's not as though we can stop an AI system from being brought into the United States in some sort of import-export control.
Right. I know you mentioned employment earlier and how AI is very much affecting that. I know this is actually a question someone asked you at our event last week, and I'd love to ask for our podcast friends. What are your thoughts on AI? I know there's some fear around it taking over people's jobs. As someone, very involved in the industry, where do you actually see that headed, in terms of how AI is already affecting and may continue to affect people and their jobs and how their jobs function and all that?
Well, I think one challenge is we're figuring this out in real time. Right? I mean, a lot of the AI systems that have been developed, take your chat GPTs or image generation systems, they weren't developed with a commercial goal in mind. And so there's a little bit of, we have the technology, let's try and find a way to use it to make money in some way, which could be by replacing people, for example. So what we're seeing right now, I think, in a lot of industries is there was an initial wave of, we're just going to fire all of the people who write our ad copy and replace it with a large language model. And very quickly, companies hired people back because there are limitations to what these AI systems are able to do. What we're seeing is a kind of augmentation of what people are able to do. So now, instead of perhaps needing 50 people who write ad copy, maybe your company only needs 10 because they are supercharged or accelerated in terms of what they can produce. But you still need those 10 people. So I think we're not going to see the wholesale replacement or elimination of jobs, job categories, right? There's almost no job that can be completely replaced by an AI system. But there are parts of almost every job, honestly, even my job as a professor, there are parts of my job that could be replaced by an AI system. And so I think what we're going to be seeing is an evolution in jobs. We're going to see jobs changing such that it's going to become critical that you're able to work collaboratively with an AI system to do your job for some people. And that's, in that sense, going to become a skill like being able to use word processing. I remember back in the days, I'm old enough to remember when it was a thing that suddenly started to appear on people's resumes. Is I know word processing systems, which now, of course, everybody does. It's just required. Except there still are to this day plenty of jobs, for example, in the trades, where people aren't using word processors every day. So jobs are going to be differentially impacted. There are going to be positions. I think being a software engineer, you're going to have to learn how to work collaboratively with an AI system, with a coding assistant. It's going to happen. If you're not starting down that road, you need to start down it now. I mentioned ad copy. That's going to be transformed in this way. But we're not going to see the wholesale elimination of it. The risk, though, that I really see in all of this is not, people have worried about what happens when all the truck drivers are gone. Truck drivers are not going to disappear as a job. The challenge, though, is that with AI, going from one to many AIs costs almost nothing and can happen almost instantly. And so if I could figure out how to, for example, have an AI system that would do half of the job of somebody who writes ad copy, that means that I could, in the matter of weeks, potentially put half of the people who write ad copy in the country out of work. Mm. And we know in this country how to handle economic disruptions. Jobs have come and gone. Coal miners used to be a much larger part of the economy than they are now. Farriers, the people who put horseshoes on, used to be a much bigger part of the economy. We know how to absorb in our economy these kinds of disruptions. It is, of course, incredibly painful and harmful to the people who are experiencing it. I don't want to minimize that. Mm-hmm. But at the economic level, if 500,000 people lose their jobs over the span of 20 years, we have ways of adapting to it. What we don't have is the ability to adapt when 500,000 people lose their jobs in 20 weeks. And that's what I fear AI is going to make possible, is the sort of rapid changes in employment profiles that I think we are not ready for collectively or politically.
So it's more about the speed at which it will happen versus the literal thing happening. Absolutely. That makes sense. Well, the positive note, I think that is probably comforting for people to hear that it's not so much that, the world's going to be taken over by robots the way people fear. It's more things are going to change, and AI is coming in alongside us, but not taking over completely.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then it becomes a matter of, are we smart about how we use it? And are we smart about how we teach people how to use it? I mean, this is a constant topic of conversation at universities, and I'm sure also, high schools around the country, is we don't know how to teach our students how to use AI because especially the generative AI systems are too new, right? It's not that we don't care. It's that literally nobody knows how to do this. We're having to figure it out. It's sort of similar to in my childhood when graphing calculators became a thing and nobody knew how to teach with them initially. And then we figured it out. And now it's the sort of thing that when my daughter was in middle school, she learned how to use a graphing calculator and it didn't impair her ability to learn math. So we're going to get there in terms of the teaching, but we're not there yet. And I think that that's, it's an exciting opportunity. Word processors have been a positive for businesses, but it's going to be a very rocky journey, I think, to where we're going to need to get in 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, definitely. It makes sense. Well, I have a kind of two-pronged question. We'll start on the doom and gloom side of the question, then end on a positive. Okay. I'm just curious, are there any issues when it comes to AI policy or regulation that you think are kind of the biggest concerns, kind of focusing first on concerns? Are there any issues that you think are really at the forefront and really are the big focus for people like your committee or just in general?
So, in my view, one of the single biggest issues, and it's not a focus, but I think it needs to be more of one, are issues around data privacy. So, in the US and in many parts of the world, we regulate data as if it's property. So, if somebody collects data on me and I give them my consent for them to collect the data on me, I now have no say about what they do with those data. I mean, obviously, if it's medical data or these sorts of things, there are some regulations that cover, but as a sort of first approximation, I can't tell them, you're allowed to use the data for this, but not for that. And I think that needs to change. I think that we are now, with AI, able to make inferences about other people that far exceed what anyone would have expected or would have thought plausible, especially when you consider the rise of data brokers, who are companies that literally buy and sell our data. And in particular, they buy and sell our data in ways that try to create aggregates of our data. So I could give my consent for you to collect one kind of data, I give consent to another company to collect another kind of data, but I don't want those to get put together because that would be problematic for me in whatever way it matters for my privacy, and I can't control that. Right? So the rise of data brokers, the rise of AI, I think, has really undermined our ability to maintain certain kinds of privacy, and in particular to maintain what in philosophy we would call our autonomy, our ability to pursue what matters to us. And I think we're only going to see this grow as we see the rise of even more algorithmic recommendation systems, as we see the rise of algorithms and AI systems that are trying to shape what we know and believe. We're all familiar with it in the context of social media, but of course it's happening in many, many other parts of our lives. And so I think that for me is sort of the big challenge that I see. It's not the new capabilities in the form of, AI can do this thing it's never been able to do before. It's that we're pairing these new capabilities with a sort of old, outdated conception of how we think about data that I think poses an enormous number of threats for us individually, but also collectively.
Are there any conversations that you've been hearing around that you feel like maybe are headed in that good direction to address that?
Yes. So a lot of the conversations that I'm part of now when it comes to things like data and privacy are very centered on use. That there has been a big shift in terms of the discussions to an awareness that use is actually what matters. It's not, in some sense, I don't care who's collecting data about me. I care what they do with the data they collect about me. I mean, I do care if they're collecting data about me, even if I didn't want it, but what really matters is how they use it. And so there has, I think, been an increasing shift outside of legislatures towards thinking about use. The challenge that we're facing is how do we get those conversations now to move into the legislatures? How do we get those challenges to move into places where people actually have the ability to create or enact meaningful governance and regulation? Perhaps the most interesting beachhead in that battle is right here in California. So in California right now, the law CPRA is that if somebody uses my data, which is not specially protected, it's not, say, biomedical data, if somebody uses my data to make inferences about my health status, they have to treat this as if it was collected that way, right? So that's a convoluted way of basically saying it's an opening to think about use. If you use my data to make certain kinds of predictions, you have a higher bar of privacy that you have to maintain for me. But that's only here in California. We are seeing some evidence that companies are actually moving some of their work out of California or are siloing their California data separate from the rest of their US or global data, precisely because there are now limits on what they can use our data for here in California. So that's good for us, bad for the rest of the country. And I think that's part of the challenge is how do we get people in Congress, in regulatory agencies to understand it's not about the data, it's about the use.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, to end on a more positive note, like I promised, sure. I'm curious, just, again, from you and your background and your perspective, are there any just general trends, whether it has to do with policy or just in general with the technology, are there any trends or innovations with AI and data that you are especially excited to see, that is exciting and maybe inspiring and positive?
Well, one thing has been, let me pick two.
Okay.
One that's in progress, one that I think is in the future. The one that's in progress has been the rise in useful what we call differential privacy techniques. Think of that as a sort of large class. Basically, the idea of differential privacy is it's a way that you manipulate the data so that you can still answer most of the questions you want about, say, at a group level, but you can't answer any questions about any individual. So the most obvious example of this is something like Google Maps, where Google Maps actually they don't store in their databases your exact location at all times, but they can still tell you how long it's going to take because of traffic, right? So differential privacy are these techniques that enable us to say how bad is the traffic on the 5 without knowing exactly where any individual is at any moment. Right? So they're a way of starting to reclaim some of our privacy. Now, the challenge with differential privacy is that it's complicated, right? It's hard to use, at least initially, the initial methods that were developed. And so what's been really exciting has been over the last few years, the ways in which differential privacy has become much more functional. That it's now the sort of thing that almost any company can just take off-the-shelf methods, use them, and they're up and running with a differentially private AI system in, 5% more time than it would have taken to do a regular AI system. And so I think there's a chance that we might be able to start to normalize the idea that people's privacy matters, that we need to be thinking about how to protect people's autonomy and agency when we're building our technical systems. So that's one thing that really excites me. The other one that's much more sort of in progress is starting to connect our AI systems to the world, which is scary in some ways, but actually is, for me, I think very exciting because that's what our current AI systems are largely lacking. So large language models are wonderful, but they're not connected to the world. They don't know that this is a plant. They don't know that this is a piece of paper. They know the words, and in the sense that they know when you can use the words, right? You wouldn't say something like, I started the fire with a plant. That would be weird. Or, take your pick of, I built a house out of a plant. I mean, we can imagine what that might mean, but those would be unusual uses. But they don't actually know what it is. And that's one of the things that is really distinctive about humans and our cognition. When we say the word plant, we know we mean this kind of thing. And so what we need to be able to start connecting what we have right now in the way of AI systems into the world. And I think that's going to be really transformative for our understanding not only of machine intelligence, but also of human intelligence. And so I'm very excited, though very nervous, because of course, once you start letting AI systems engage with the world and let them start really doing things in the world, a whole new host of ethical issues come up. I mean, I think this is really, it's an exciting conversation, and I think it's really important that organizations like DSA are trying to reach out to the public. I think that's something that you have a lot of academics who are building interesting new ideas, pushing the frontiers of knowledge. You have companies creating systems that can be deployed. You have government and regulators who are trying to figure out how to manage this whole system. And that's actually a tiny fraction of the people in this world. The vast majority of these people are not in any of those three groups. And their voices, I think, systematically get neglected by all of us in these three groups. And so I think that that's where it's really crucial that there be organizations like DSA or people listening to this podcast who work to empower the public, to bring the public's voice into these debates, to help people recognize that we're not operating in isolation, but rather we need to really be thinking about the implications of what we're doing for everybody, not just the people we happen to talk to on a daily basis.
Definitely. Promise, didn't pay him to say that. Give DSA a little plug, but it's so true. And you've been so supportive of DSA, from the beginning with our events and our podcast. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, especially just hearing your explanation of things and your perspective. It's really helpful in we used the word overwhelming before, and I think that is how it can feel. So really appreciate your time. I'm sure we'll drag you in here again for more podcast topics as the tech keeps evolving. So thank you so much for now.
A real pleasure. Always happy to come back.
If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and don't forget to follow the Data Science Alliance on any of your favorite social media platforms. Also, DSA is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we would really appreciate your support. You can do a one-time donation, become a member, volunteer with us, or come to our events. We have lots going on all the time at our office here in San Diego, California. Even if you don't live in the area, though, you can still get involved. So go to our website, datasciencealliance.org. Otherwise, we'll see you here next time on The Data Slice.